So on Tuesday, April 14th, 2026, we are going to see four of the most statistically dominant teams in AFT Dice history walk into the exact same stadium.
Right.
And the math is basically telling us that at least two of them are going to leave with their Season 12 campaigns just completely derailed. So welcome to the deep dive.
It really is the ultimate localized bottleneck. Like when you look at the raw data for round 12, the spatial distribution is just staggering.
Yeah, it's wild. Today, our mission is to dig into this highly specific preview document for AFT Dice Season 12, Round 12. And, if you follow the league, you're already familiar with the standard format, right?
Sure, for sure.
You know that every team's current standing is presented as a picture, which is that four-part numerical sequence acting as their statistical DNA for the season.
Yeah, their barcode, basically.
Exactly, their
Right.
barcode. We all know those basics. But we aren't here to just read the ladder to you today. We want to look at the incredibly rare, honestly highly volatile alignment of these sequences that is about to hit us on April 14th.
Because treating these sequences like a standard sports table is, it's a massive mistake. A sequence like 18-2-9-0 isn't just a win-loss record.
Right, it's not just points on a board.
Exactly. It's a structural schematic. It tells you exactly how a team is engineered to perform, where their vulnerabilities lie, and how they interact with opposing structures on the field.
Well, let's jump straight into the heavyweights then, because that's where the schematic gets super fascinating. When we look at the primary power rating, so that first digit in the sequence, we see a very clear elite tier.
Yeah, the big four.
Right. You have the Western Bulldogs sitting on an 18. Their full picture is 18-2-9-0. And then St. Kilda's just breathing down their necks with a 17-2-9-0.
So close.
We drop slightly to the Geelong Cats at 16-4-7-0. And Fremantle rounding out the top with a 15-4-7-0.
And those are your four gravitational centers for round 12. They hold the highest primary baseline power.
Right, but here's where I want to push back a little bit, or at least put a theory to you. The primary number gets all the media attention, obviously, because an 18 is bigger than a 15.
Sure, it's the flashy number.
But look at the internal ratios, the second and third numbers. The Bulldogs and St. Kilda share an identical 2-9 middle structure.
Yep.
And Geelong and Fremantle share an identical 4-7 middle structure. If I'm reading the Season 12 meta right, a 2-9 foundation implies a team that relies heavily on, defensive attrition, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like a high tertiary containment rating of 9, backed up by a very conservative secondary yield of 2. They basically just grind opponents into the dirt.
That is exactly the right lens to use. The
Yeah.
2-9 structure is an absolute vice grip in AFT Dice. But I'd frame the difference between the Bulldogs and St. Kilda slightly differently.
Okay, how so?
Well, the fact that they share that identical 2-9 internal ratio means they're playing the exact same tactical game. The only difference separating them in this entire data set is that single digit in the leading power number.
The 18 versus the 17.
Correct.
So the Bulldogs aren't doing anything structurally different than St. Kilda. They are just executing that vice grip with a tiny fraction more primary power.
Exactly right. And then you contrast that 2-9 structure with Geelong and Fremantle's 4-7.
Right, which is completely different.
A 4-7 is a much more balanced, flexible matrix. A 4 on the secondary yield means they are, taking more offensive risks, supported by a slightly lower containment rating of 7. It's just a completely different philosophical approach to the game.
Which makes the middle class of the league look really interesting by comparison. Like if we scan down the document to the Sydney Swans, they're sitting at a 9.650.
Yep.
Port Adelaide is an 8.650. North Melbourne is a 6.650. They all share that 6.5 middle.
Which is an inherently volatile structure. A 6 secondary yield against a 5 tertiary containment means they are built for shootouts.
Just nonstop action.
Pretty much. They bleed points, but they try to outscore the damage.
So if a 6-5 shootout team like North Melbourne goes up against one of those 2-9 vice grip teams, the math dictates a clash of completely opposing philosophies.
Totally.
But that brings us to the most urgent part of this data. Because having identical or contrasting pictures is only half the battle. None of this theoretical data matters until these teams are forced onto the same physical turf.
Right.
And this is where the schedule for Tuesday, April 14th, genuinely looks like, an error in the system.
You're talking about the Marvel Stadium anomaly?
It is crazy. It's like organizing a massive music festival and putting almost all the headliners on one stage. The infrastructure of the league standings is going to blow a fuse.
It really is.
Because out of the 9 matches scheduled for round 12, an astonishing 4 of them are locked into Marvel Stadium.
Let's just break down the sheer statistical mass converging on that single venue. It's wild.
Okay, so you have Hawthorn playing the West Coast Eagles.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Western Bulldogs, our 18-point heavyweights facing Melbourne, who hold a very dangerous picture of 13-5-6-0. Then you have North Melbourne, and they're 6-6-5-0, taking on the Brisbane Lions, who sit at 12-5-6-0. And finally, Carlton, armed with a 14-5-6-0, clashing with St Kilda, the 17-2-9-0 juggernauts.
So if you calculate the primary power ratings just walking through the turnstiles at Marvel Stadium, you are looking at 88 total power points localized in one building.
Wait, 88? How does that even compare to the rest of the round?
Well, let's do the math. Adelaide Oval is hosting 2 matches. Right?
Yeah, Adelaide against Collingwood and Port Adelaide against the Gold Coast Suns.
Exactly. The total combined power points there, only 20.
Wow.
Then Optus Stadium has Fremantle versus Richmond, totaling 17 points. GMHBA Stadium has Geelong and Essendon, which brings 26 points. And the SCG hosts Sydney and GWS, totaling 20.
So the rest of the venues combined hold 83 power points.
Yeah.
And Marvel Stadium alone is holding 88. It is literally hosting more than half the statistical weight of the entire league in a single round.
Which is why Marvel isn't just a stadium on April 14th. It is a statistical bottleneck. The outcomes here aren't just going to shift the ladder. They are going to totally cannibalize the top tier.
Yeah, they have to.
Look at Carlton's 14 taking on St Kilda's 17. That is a massive collision. St Kilda wants to enforce their 2-9 attrition trap, but Carlton is bringing a 5-6 middle structure.
Right.
If Carlton breaks the trap, St Kilda's primary power rating takes a direct hit. And simultaneously, the Bulldogs are trying to defend their 18 against Melbourne's 13.
So whoever survives the Marvel Stadium circuit breaker is basically going to dictate the narrative for the rest of Season 12, because the top teams are actively feeding on each other in the same physical space.
Exactly. And while everyone is going to be focused on those massive numbers, the 18s and the 17s colliding, there is a micro-level anomaly walking into Marvel Stadium that could easily act as a detonator for the whole thing.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
We need to talk about the 4th digit. Because in any standard 4-part AFT dice sequence, it is almost human nature to ignore that trailing number. Out of 18 teams in this preview document, 15 of them have a picture sequence that ends in a 0.
Yeah.
Like 18-2-9-0, 9-6-5-0. It's just white noise.
Right. And in the mechanics of the system, a trailing 0 simply represents standard variance. It just means the team is operating under the normal rules of probability.
Right. But then you hit the 3 exceptions. You have Collingwood sitting at 5-6-4-1, the GWS Giants at 11-5-5-1, and then Hawthorn. Hawthorn sequence is 7-5-4-2. They don't just have a 1, they have a trailing 2, the only trailing 2 in the entire league.
It is the rarest variable on the board.
So here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to challenge how we look at this. Is a trailing digit a sign of carryover resilience, or is it a structural penalty?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because if it's a penalty, Hawthorn is dragging an anchor into round 12. But if it's a variance modifier, if it allows them to manipulate standard probabilities, then Hawthorn isn't a baseline 7 team. They are a highly volatile threat.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, let's look at the distribution. If it were purely a penalty or a reward, you would expect it to correlate with the primary power number.
Right, like only the top teams would have it.
But it doesn't. GWS holds a solid upper mid 11. Hawthorn is a lower mid 7. Collingwood is a struggling 5. The anomaly is completely independent of their baseline dominance.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In AFT dice mechanics, a trailing digit greater than 0 introduces conditional triggers. It fundamentally destabilizes the standard mathematical model.
So a level 2 anomaly modifier for Hawthorn means they're playing a completely different game than the 15 teams carrying a 0.
Exactly. And consider where they are taking that level 2 modifier. They aren't playing in an isolated, quiet venue. Hawthorn is bringing the league's most volatile mathematical wildcards straight into Marvel Stadium.
The 88-point pressure cooker. And they are playing the West Coast Eagles there, which is honestly the perfect transition into the absolute floor of this data set. Because while Hawthorn is wielding a trailing 2, West Coast is telling a story of sheer systemic failure.
Yeah, the lopsided landscapes of round 12.
We've talked about the 18s and the 17s. Now we have to look at the mathematical chasms, because the lowest starting sequence in the round belongs to West Coast. Their picture is 1830. And right above them is Richmond, sitting on a 2830.
A primary power of 1 and primary power of 2. It's rough.
And the schedule is ruthless. Richmond, with their leading 2, has to travel to Optus Stadium. Waiting for them is Fremantle, whose picture is 15470.
Yeah.
So from a pure mechanics standpoint, if you're listening to this, it is so easy to dismiss this game entirely. Like a 15 playing a 2 seems like a predetermined slaughter. Why should we care? Why does a matchup with that vast of a disparity actually matter structurally?
Because in any data set, the extremes validate the middle. A team with a primary power of 2 represents a very specific kind of threat. They have no baseline left to protect. They're desperate.
Completely. Let's break down Richmond's sequence. They are 2-8-3-0. That 8-3 internal ratio is a disaster. It means they are attempting highly skewed, reckless offensive strategies with terrible defensive retention.
They're basically just throwing the ball and hoping for the best.
Exactly. But look at Fremantle. They are 15-4-7-0. They rely on that stable 4-7 foundation to generate their wins predictably.
Right.
When a 15 plays a 2, all the statistical pressure is on the 15. The 15 is built for consistency. The 2 is built on high-risk, high-reward variance.
Oh, wait, I see where you're going with this. If Richmond hits a statistical outlier, if their reckless 8-3 structure actually connects early in the game, Fremantle's consistent 4-7 structure might not be flexible enough to adapt.
Precisely. The stability of the 15 can actually become a straitjacket when confronted with the pure chaos of a team that has literally nothing to lose.
Wow.
You can't appreciate the tightness of a match like North Melbourne 6 trying to upset Brisbane's 12 without understanding the structural vulnerability that exists between a 15 and a 2. It's the ultimate ceiling versus the ultimate floor. And if Richmond's 2 somehow disrupts Fremantle's 15 at Optus Stadium, it doesn't just give Richmond 4 points.
Yeah.
It completely devalues the credibility of the entire elite tier.
Right.
Because if a 15 can fall to a 2, then the Bulldogs' 18 suddenly looks a lot less secure.
The entire ecosystem is interconnected. The bottom tier isn't just filler. It is the foundation that the heavyweights stand on. When the foundation shakes, the upper echelons feel the tremors.
Let's also look at the other mismatches, too, because it's not just Richmond and Fremantle. You have the Gold Coast Suns sitting on a 4-7-4-0.
Yep.
And they have to face Port Adelaide, who are an 8-6-5-0 at the Adelaide Oval. You mentioned Essendon's 10 taking on Geelong 16. Then there was the Sydney Swans at 9, going up against GWS at 11 at the SCG.
Now, that Sydney versus GWS match is particularly tense.
Yeah.
Not just because of the proximity in their primary numbers, a 9 versus an 11, but because GWS is carrying one of those rare trailing anomalies. They have a 1 at the end of their sequence, 11-5-5-1.
Oh, right.
And Sydney is a baseline 0, 9-6-5-0.
So Sydney is trying to play a standard, high-scoring 6-5 shootout game, but GWS has a conditional trigger in their back pocket.
Exactly. And GWS's internal structure is a 5-5. It is perfectly symmetrical. They have equal offensive and defensive weight, plus that wild card modifier.
Yep.
While Sydney's 6-5 is slightly top-heavy, the math suggests that GWS can absorb Sydney's initial scoring bursts and then use their trailing 1 to just dictate the later stages of the match.
It really is a matrix of code once you know how to read it. When we started this deep dive, we were looking at what seemed like a standard round 12 preview document, just a list of teams, venues, some numbers.
Yeah, just a spreadsheet.
But by unpacking the mechanics of these picture sequences, a completely different narrative emerges.
We've moved far beyond just looking at who is ranked first and who is ranked last.
We really have.
Yeah.
We've seen how the 2-9 internal structures of the Western Bulldogs and St. Kilda reveal an identical, suffocating defensive philosophy, separated only by a single point of primary power.
Right, and we mapped the staggering logistics of Marvel Stadium, identifying it as this massive 88-point statistical bottleneck where the league's top-heavy power is going to cannibalize itself.
We dug into the mystery of the trailing digit, realizing that Hawthorn isn't just a 7-point team. They are a highly destabilizing force, bringing a level 2 anomaly into that exact same stadium.
And we reframed the bottom of the ladder, discovering how a 2-point team like Richmond isn't just a guaranteed win for Fremantle, but a volatile agent of chaos that could crack the structural integrity of the entire Season 12 meta.
So you are now equipped with the underlying architecture of this specific moment in AFT Dice. You aren't just looking at who plays who. You're looking at how their statistical DNA interacts.
Which brings us to our final thought.
Because theoretical math is only theoretical until the whistle blows.
Exactly. Everything we have unpacked today is anchored to a very specific, immovable deadline, Tuesday, 14 April 2026.
Right.
That is when the theoretical structures collide with physical reality.
And as you watch these games unfold, I want you to keep one lingering question in mind. When the dust finally settles on April 14th, and all those barcodes have been scanned, tested, and broken, especially inside the 4-match high-voltage pressure cooker of Marvel Stadium, how many of those trailing zeros across the league are going to permanently mutate into ones and twos for round 13?